week after the Italian Grand Prix, former US President Jimmy Carter arrived in Port-au-Prince, the capital of Haiti, to negotiate with the military junta of Raoul, which had ousted elected President Jean-Bertrand Aristide in 1991. The coup and subsequent repression had triggered a large influx of refugees entering the US on anything that would float, which in turn made it an international issue. In May, the UN Security Council had ordered Cedras to leave Haiti and allow Aristide to be restored to power, and Carter's negotiations ended with him agreeing to do so, and US forces arrived in Operation Uphold Democracy to oversee the transition of power. The US government, anticipating having to actually invade Haiti, had assembled a modest coalition of Caribbean countries and promises of Dutch, Belgian, Polish and Argentine assistance, but in the end it wasn't really necessary, and the only international contribution seems to have been the presence of a Dutch frigate and patrol aircraft which were based locally anyway. If they could receive NBC in Haiti, the US forces might have enjoyed watching the pilot episode of sitcom Friends, which aired a few days afterwards, with a couple of days after that the launch in syndication of the Marvel Action Hour, which featured new versions of Iron Man, starring Robert Hayes, and the Fantastic Four. The F1 teams assembled in Portugal, again minus Michael Schumacher, serving out the second of his two-race ban, but he remained the topic of much conversation nonetheless, as rumours suggested the constant connection of him with Benetton's series of controversies was tarnishing his image, and Schumi himself agreed that yes, his manager Willy Weber probably was talking to other teams, but that was his job, especially at this time of year. Rumours flew about $15 million offers on the table from Williams, McLaren and Ferrari, which enabled Weber in the end to negotiate a better contract with Benetton, who would now pay him $16 million for 1995, and his contract would now go only to the end of 1995, not the end of 1996 as previously. Over at Williams, Damon Hill was also finally announced as a Williams driver for 1995, but the identity of his teammate was still highly contested. David Coulthard would be entering his last race of the year at Estoril and was in high demand if Nigel Mansell did return to the seat. Coulthard's manager Tim Way spoke to Niki Lauda, Ron Dennis, Flavio Briatore and Peter Zauber over the course of the weekend. And Rubens Barrichello was another highly in-demand driver. It was an open secret that the Marlborough-backed Brazilian had been in talks with Ron Dennis for months, and it had been expected that it would be announced at Monza, but he'd been unhappy with what was on the table, a one-year-only deal, and probably having to play number two to Hakkinen. Reportedly, his sponsors were now looking at trying to get him into a Ferrari, but that would probably have to be for 1996 or beyond, because Alesi and Berger were both already signed up. So it looked like Rubinho was staying put for now, though that didn't stop Eddie Jordan wheedling a bit more money out of Philip Morris for the privilege. One reason Ron Dennis was only willing to offer Rubens a one-year deal was that he was in advanced negotiations with Mercedes, who might want to put a German in the car from 1996 onwards. Still, there was nothing official, but Ron had been photographed in Stuttgart several times, and after an unofficial heads-up from Mansour Ojeh that they might want to be looking at other options, Peugeot were now talking to Jordan, the next team down in the table, who were still on the lookout for a decent, cheapish or even free engine. The French motoring press, of course, were howling with outrage at the prospect of Peugeot being unceremoniously dumped after just 1 year, and pointed to the team's first double points finish at Monza as proof of progress. There were some more left-field driver moves under discussion too. Bernie Eccleston was still keen to get IndyCar star Jacques Villeneuve into F1, while fellow Canadian Indy driver Paul Tracy was in Portugal, visiting the Benetton fit with a view to testing a car. Meanwhile, Christian Fittipaldi was beginning to get frustrated with never getting a chance to show his stuff in F1, and was contemplating a move in the other direction, joining Uncle Emerson on the US circuit. Looking to the more immediate future, there was one more race in Europe, the European Grand Prix at Jerez, a late replacement for the proposed Argentine Grand Prix, before the two long-haul races in Japan and Australia. Lotus, Larrouse, Simtek, Pacific and Arrows were all balking at the $350,000 bill for the trip, and had all suggested that they might not make the trip. While one or two teams had occasionally skipped these races in the past, the prospect of losing nearly half the grid and thus falling foul of contracts promising a full grid of 26 led Bernie to put his foot down and insist everyone go or be kicked out of the championship, so there would be a scramble to recruit pay drivers. Lotus had theirs back. Philippe Adams would take the wheel of number 11 again, but he didn't have the wherewithal to take it any further, so what would happen beyond that was anyone's guess. Incidentally, last time he was in the car I read a thing that said his name was pronounced Adam, but then after I recorded the audio I found that video of him during touring cars and the French commentator was calling him Philippe Adams, so I guess I'll revert to the one I'm more familiar with. Anyway, the team had to call in the receivers in the aftermath of their disappointment in Italy, and the writing was on the wall, but in Portugal they had another chance to get a good result out of the new Mugen engine, still just one block, which was naturally in Herbert's car, and the latest attempt to make the 109 chassis work added some little winglets to the back of the side pod. Things were rosier over at Ferrari, where Jean Alesi had taken a bit of a break, cleared his head and was looking much happier, though he admitted the Estoril track probably wouldn't really suit the Ferrari. Gerhard Berger, meanwhile, had a new Portuguese girlfriend, model Ana Corvo, to impress, so he was definitely raring to go. The track had been modified from last year in line with the safety changes demanded. In this case, the fast right-hander at Tanque, turn 8, was now a trio of slow bands, which hadn't proved popular with the drivers, while the final long corner had been renamed the Parabolica Ayrton Senna. Friday qualifying was under blue skies, and Hill and Barrichello made the early running, but Berger went quickest by half-time and couldn't be beaten. Hill's attempts cut short when Eddie Irvine spun into him and the Williams ended up upside down in the gravel. And then the wind got up on Saturday, times went up, and Berger had his 10th career pole. Hill's time was good enough for second though, with Coulthard on excellent third, his best yet, ahead of Hakkinen on the second row. Alesi just couldn't quite get his Ferrari working and was down in fifth alongside a jubilant Ukio Katayama getting better and better and out-qualifying Mark Blundell yet again, the Briton down in 12th. The second McLaren of Brundle lined up alongside Barrichello, they were 7th and 8th, with Frentzen 9th and Verstappen 10th, just as he had been in Italy, while Leto had improved but only to 14th, now lining up alongside Irvine. The new Mugen was nowhere near as effective in Portugal as it had been in Italy, and Johnny Herbert could only manage 20th, with Adams improving on his debut in the other Lotus to beat Gounon into 25th place. Jean-Marc, driving his last race for Simtek unless he could find some more sponsorship from somewhere, was last after a series of spins and offs, but a comfortable 1.7 seconds ahead of Gasho, as the Pacifics once again suffered a series of engine failures that ruined whatever slim chances they may have had of improving on their times. There was a minor crisis on Friday evening when a group of Ferrari engineers and mechanics came to leave the circuit at 9:45 p.m, along with a handful from Ligier and Benetton, only to find out the gate was locked. After a long day with a glass of nice rosé and a bed beckoning, they decided to try and break through the gate rather than wandering around looking for an alternative. Alerted by the noise, a posse of National Republican Guard quickly arrived, followed by the armed police, and the team personnel were arrested. An intervention by Jean Tot, who vouched for the fact that they were genuine staff, not souvenir-hunting fans, got them released, but the police also faxed pictures of their passes to the race stewards, who came down on Ferrari like a ton of bricks and issued a $50,000 fine and a one-race ban suspended for 3 races. Outraged, Luca Di Montezemolo threatened to pull the team out of the weekend, but the crisis passed after some hasty diplomacy from Max and Bernie, and probably from Gerhardt too, and things could proceed. A year on from his memorable McLaren debut, Mika Hakkinen had done a promo video for the media showing his Grand Prix preparations. Annoyingly, I can only find it dubbed into Russian, but there's a link in the description if you want to watch the whole thing. Mika did well in Sunday's warm-up, third in the timings behind Coulthard and Hill, and just ahead of Brundle, with the Jordans 5th and 6th and Berger down in 7th. By afternoon, the sky was overcast, but it's still warm and didn't look like rain as they headed off on the parade lap. Ukio Katayama, it seemed, was just destined to be let down by his equipment every time he did well in qualifying. His gearbox started putting him in neutral just at the end of the lap, and he was forced to detour slowly into the pit lane, getting going a full minute after everyone else. The rest tore off the line, but Hill got away slowly and found himself once again behind his teammate, while Alesi had got one of his trademark rocket starts to go up to 4th ahead of Hakkinen and Barrichello. Frentzen had also had a good start, picking up a couple of places, so as they completed the first lap, the top 10 were Berger, Coulthard, Hill, Alesi, Hakkinen, Barrichello, Frentzen, Verstappen, Brundle and Fittipaldi. Brundle, who'd lost out with a poor start, was all over Verstappen but couldn't find an opening, as Berger and the Williams twins immediately began to leave Alesi behind. David Coulthard had a point to prove just as much as anyone else here, and was sticking with Berger and putting pressure on the Austrian veteran, and with plenty of race yet to go, the team were happy enough for him to be the one making the running. As so often, the Williamses were faster through the twisty bits, especially the new chicane, but just couldn't match the Ferrari's V12 power on the straights. But pressure was pressure, and Berger was notoriously hard on tyres, so it was more a case of pushing him to make a mistake or wear out his rubber, rather than hoping to catch the experienced race leader flat-footed. Alesi, meanwhile, was completely on his own already, still struggling with understeer and by now nearly 5 seconds behind his teammate, but having powered away from Häkkinen to the tune of about 4 seconds too. On lap 8, though, it was Berger who was the first retirement of the race, his gearbox failing at the entrance to the new complex and putting Coulthard into the lead with Hill behind. So, a Williams won too, and, assuming they remained reliable, merely a question of at what point the team would instruct Coulthard to give place, and whether, in what could be his last race for the team, he would comply with good grace. The fine off-camera scrap between Verstappen and Brundle was thus promoted a place to one for 7th, with Frentzen just ahead of the pair in the last points-paying place. But the cameras remained with the leading pair, as Coulthard continued lapping faster and faster. By the time David Brabham made an unscheduled pit stop on lap 15 to have his car checked after a spin, the Scot was among the first of the backmarkers, as Katayama went wheel-to-wheel with Alboreto. Coulthard made his own first stop quite early, lap 18, suggesting he'd started on a light load of fuel, emerging just behind Philippe Adams, who moved smartly over as Morbidelli came in for his own stop. Hill was in next time around with a shorter stop, but still returned to the track behind Coulthard as Alesi took up the lead ahead of Häkkinen and Barrichello, with the Williamses now 4th and 5th for the time being. The scrapping Verstappen and Brundle came in and went out together on lap 20, then Alesi was in from the lead on lap 23 along with Häkkinen, so Barrichello led for 3 laps until he made his own stop, and the Williamses were restored to the top 2 places, with Frentzen, on a one-stopper, now promoted to 3rd. Alesi had switched to new tyres rather than a scrubbed inset, and it did seem to be helping, as he gained on the Sauber with Häkkinen in tow. Coulthard, meanwhile, was going back through the backmarkers again, relapping Dalmas before setting about Comas and the other Larrouse, who was fighting hard with Alboreto. The pair were so absorbed in their own battle that Comas accidentally balked Coulthard, who had to go wide and picked up a load of gravel and rubber marbles on his tyres, and in the process allowed Hill to nip through and take the lead. Comas headed into the pits next time around, having cracked his left rear suspension somewhere in the previous 29 laps, and retired. Katayama's frustrating race was ended at the same time as his gearbox gave up for good this time, as half-distance approached. Coulthard had scrubbed most of the muck off his tyres and was sticking with Hill, but showed every inclination of spending the second half of the race as a good team player, which, aside from the potential for car problems for either of them, seemed to suck much of the interest out of the race, at least as far as the front was concerned. Frentzen dropped out of 3rd when his differential failed on lap 31, his 6th DNF in a row, which put Alesi back into 3rd, with Häkkinen, Barrichello and Fittipaldi 6th until he made his one stop. Alesi, meanwhile, was making his way through traffic and came up on David Brabham to put a second lap on him, but the Australian either didn't see him or didn't realise he was coming through from that far back, and the resulting contact saw both of them ending their race in the gravel on lap 39. Yannick Dalmas nearly did the same to Hill shortly afterwards, as he moved back in after being lapped by Fittipaldi. In fact, watching the leaders thread their way through traffic was about the most interesting thing to do, as the race had become rather processional by this point. Verstappen and Brundle had been promoted to 5th and 6th after Fittipaldi's stop and Alesi's retirement, but they are now 7 seconds apart, and any battle between them was on the timing sheets rather than on the track. Brundle was the first in for a second stop, the team turning him round in a smidge over 8.2 seconds. Gounon blotted his copybook again. He'd been having a bit of a weekend of that, with an off-track excursion that spread dust everywhere and gave Hill and Coulthard a fright as they were just coming past at the time, with David getting right back onto Damon's gearbox as the result. But there was no fight between them as the number 2 Williams peeled in at the end of the lap for his second stop, emerging just in time to nearly tread on Barrichello's nose as he was chasing Häkkinen. Again, Hill was in next time around, but this time he actually managed to get out ahead of his teammate, having put in an in-lap 2 seconds faster than David's. Häkkinen came in too, so Hill was back in the lead just in time to nearly be taken out by Dalmas again. Damon was now making his way through lapping the top 10, passing Irvine, whose Hart engine was smoking intermittently, and Panis, who were running 10th and 9th respectively, and their fight held Coulthard up for a while. The pair were both reeling in 8th-placed Fittipaldi, whose engine was losing power after his long stop. De Cesaris missed his braking point at turn 3 and went off while running 14th, only retirement number 7 after 54 of the 71 laps as the race wore on to its seemingly foregone conclusion. Eric Bernard nearly replicated Häkkinen's terrifying crash from the previous year, getting very wide coming out of the last corner, and JJ Leto likewise rode up a curb, but he was unable to keep it under control and ended up in the gravel. He would be giving that car back to Schumacher for the next race, which raised questions over his future, which pretty clearly didn't lie with Benetton. Not that Verstappen was having it all his own way either, nearly going off on the muck that Bernard had spread on the track with 8 laps to go. Gounod had a puncture and turned slowly around for new wheels and set off again, spinning on his cold tyres to boot, while Verstappen, evidently none the worse for his excursion, had pulled right up behind 4th place Barrichello. But the camera stuck with Damon and David as the two cruised round the final lap in formation and, enough fuel this time, took the first 1-2 finish of the season for any team and David's first ever podium position. Hakkinen was third, his 4th bronze medal of the season, with Barrichello holding off Verstappen for his 4th 3-pointer of the season. Verstappen took 2 points for Benetton for 5th place, and Brundle had the final point, so it was another double points finish for McLaren Peugeot. Panis finished 9th, but was disqualified for a worn skid block, probably damaged during an off-track excursion, so everyone behind moved up, a total of 16 finishers, not bad for what was expected to be an attrition-heavy race. So out onto the podium they went, Hill looking delighted as well he might, having achieved exactly what he set out to and taken maximum advantage of Schumacher's 2-race ban. Going into the last 3 races of the season then, there was just 1 point between Schumacher and Hill, while Williams had taken the lead of the Constructors' Championship for the first time. Whether cynically engineered by the FIA, as some would have it, or just desserts for repeated rule-breaking, for Benetton, the end result should be a cracking title run-in, with a fired-up Michael Schumacher returning, and none of the 3 circuits particularly favouring one team over the other. Elsewhere, there was disappointment at Ferrari as they'd recorded a double DNF for the 3rd time in 4 races, and Alesi hadn't finished since Silverstone. And this wasn't the first time he'd had a run-in with David Brabham either, both men naturally blaming the other. Mika Hakkinen, for his part in the press conference, reflected that it was the team's tactics that had kept him ahead of Barrichello and bemoaned the lack-end of top-end power from the Peugeot engine. He did stress that Peugeot were working on it, but it seemed obvious that the relationship was, if not fully over yet, then definitely on the rocks. So 3 weeks until the last European race of the year, and while few were looking forward to visiting the dusty, twisting Jerez circuit again, the sense of anticipation about the title race, seemingly a foregone conclusion a couple of months ago, was rising.